Okay, so Dad, we've got some of your special treasures here. Do you want to tell us what they are and where they came from?
Well, they're Edison Phonographs, and perhaps I can give you a little bit of the background of these two extraordinary machines. The famous inventor, Thomas Alva Edison, of course most notable for his invention of the light globe, but he had such an inventive mind. He was big on early telephones, others probably did a bit better, but then he addressed himself to the whole idea of trying to record the human voice. And eventually in 1877 he did succeed on a cylinder and some alfoil of roughly recording the human voice. And somebody said to him, Mr. Edison, what is the point of wanting to record a human voice? What possible use or interest could it be? So he thought carefully, and he said, you could use it to teach your grandchildren.
Well, here you are, teaching your grandchildren.
Well, you could put it that way, but the idea was that your wisdom, your fount of wisdom, accumulated over many, many years of life and all its experiences, you could tell your young grandchildren how to succeed and not to avoid the same pitfalls that I fell into. I can't imagine anything more utterly stupefyingly boring. It took a while before people realized that if they had the voice of somebody who was really worth listening to, then somebody might be interested in the recording. I'll give you an example. I think it was in the 1920s. Somebody came across a box of old cylinders, and they had human voices on them. Who were they? There were no labels. One or two was obvious, because one was introduced as the trumpeter who played at the charge of the Light Brigade, and that was obvious enough. And then another one was obvious. Here was this old frail lady saying, God bless all the companions and those I worked with in Crimea. So that was who?
Florence Nightingale.
Florence Nightingale. But there were a couple of others that had no idea they were elderly statesmen. So there was a list, but not identifiable, that said one of them was Mr. W.E. Gladstone. They then found that Gladstone's last secretary was still alive, so they brought him in to BBC House, and they played him a number of these discs, and no. Then suddenly the old man was alert, and he sprang to his feet. Well, as much as a man in his 80s could. He got to his feet, and he said, that is Mr. Gladstone.
Fantastic, isn't it?
So I've got a gramophone there, which has the voice of all of those three things plus some others.
Okay, so Dad, you were telling us about Gladstone and the recording from him. Do you want to tell us about these two machines?
Well, yes. One is called the Edison Gem Photograph. It dates to about 1900. That one. They were produced a little bit earlier. And this one is about 1905, the Edison Home. And Home tells you straight away that the intended market was the upper middle classes. They cost about 2 guineas, which was well beyond the reach of a working class man. 2 guineas was something you'd have to save up for. And the cylinders that sit in here were probably about 5 shillings each. Again, a considerable thing. Not 50 cents. It was quite an investment.
And how do they work?
There's nothing electrical, nothing at all. It's all entirely mechanical. So what you see here is clockwork with springs and a governor, and you wind it up. And close it.
So you've already wound this one? No, you're winding it now.
This one hasn't. So this is the first, more or less the first stage of the invention. So we've got a slot in here, crank it. Starting to wind now. I won't fully wind it in case I broke this spring. It comes out. And you've got a switch here. And you lower it onto the beginning of the cylinder.
So the cylinder's inside.
The cylinder's here.
Ah.
There's the cylinder. It's the same kind of contraption that the early gramophones had. And I'll explain the difference in a gramophone and a phonograph in a while. So you turn it on. The chap who sold it to me, he had quite a large collection. He'd got rid of a thing about them. And then he decided to get rid of some of them. Most of the horns hadn't survived.
Mm.
And so he had the one over there, see? He had about 100 of those spun off specially. But
oh, really?
On one occasion, I was using it in class. One of the boys, this is Barker, said, "Sir, I've got one of these old ones at home. Would you like it?" I said, "I certainly would." It has had to have a bit of repair done.
Wow.
So I had a bit of repair done. And all I had to do here was to polish it up.
Yeah, yeah.
It's decayed a bit there, the brass
It's a
has
little
decayed.
bit of a knock.
But yeah, so the chap had painted it up.
Mm.
That's during the restoration,
Okay.
which cost a fair bit, but there you go. And it fits exactly on the
Beautiful.
on that, yeah.
Okay, so Dad, we've done a little bit of repair work and I think we're ready to go.
Let's hope this time. It's a late Victorian song called "Seems to Me I've Always Loved You." Very Victorian.
And so that cylinder's over 100 years old.
Yes, it would
Probably.
be about 120 years old.
Yeah.
Now, very, very scratchy. The sound is tinny. Of course it's tinny because this horn is tin. The brass thing, but the amplification. There's no electronic amplification at all. It's entirely mechanical. So there's mechanical motion on the cylinder, sideways, to and fro. And then the sound is transmitted through this little mechanism here and amplified slightly through the horn there. Now, you wouldn't play it these days. You wouldn't play it. But, of course, there is no precursor to this at all. And so, after a while, famous artists would record these so that people could hear the voices of famous artists. Nellie Melba, Enrico Caruso. I mean, those names are still familiar now, but others whose names have completely gone. You could get humorous recordings, for instance, Sir Harry Lauder, the music hall artist. He recorded things too, in a broad Scottish voice with some laughter. It's okay, you scratch your head, what are they laughing at? They have heard of Harry Lauder, they've heard of Nellie Melba, they've never heard her voice. There's no previous means of mass communication of sound from famous people, and then a little bit later on, instrumentalists, horn, piano of course you couldn't really use. Orchestral music, yes, a little. One of the recordings I have here is from the anvil chorus. And the anvil chorus, of course, depends on an anvil being struck. So you hear the anvil being struck, and then the orchestra playing its best. You can hear the violins, Can you hear the bass instruments? No.
And would the original have always been that scratchy, or
Yes.
has it deteriorated?
It may have deteriorated, but it was always pretty scratchy.
Right. And the cylinders, what are they made out of?
Good question. I've forgotten, but they had some special stuff. I think it was called ambrolite, and very, very fragile. So if you drop one, that's it. It doesn't survive. A bit later on, they made them on something else which could survive a bit of trauma, but the first ones, no. They were a single drop cylinder.
And just want to open the lid again and
All right,
show
we'll
the
take a look
inside.
inside. Take a look at the clockwork. So I'll set it going.
Maybe it won't run in that position.
Should do. It may not be wound up enough. I didn't want to overwind it in case it broke the spring. There's no repairing these things. You can see it's a very straightforward clockwork motor inside, and there's a rather big spring inside that metal contraption there. Could probably do with a bit of oiling. Remember, of course, there's nothing electrical here. It's purely moving parts which need to be kept lubricated. Not the record itself. You don't lubricate that.
Okay, so Dad, those particular Edisons, where did they come from?
Well, a bit of background there, and the background is this. I was doing my dip-ed course at the University of New England. I drove Miss Patricia Young up there, drove her back again, 1963. The history method lecturer was a very nice bloke, very good communicator, Lionel Gilbert. One day he took us to the Armadale Folk Museum, and in the Armadale Folk Museum was an Edison phonograph, which intrigued all of us. He played a couple of records. One was a Civil War song, "Just Before the Battle, Mother, I Will Always Think of You." So very, very Victorian. At that time, of course, the American Civil War, the phonograph hadn't been invented. So those Civil War songs were still current at the end of the century. So a little bit after that, I saw an advertisement for an Edison phonograph in the paper, I think. Phoned the bloke up, and this is a chap, elderly man then, and he was thinking of passing on some of his collection. So he sold me the Edison Gem Photograph. I think it was about £60. Quite a lot of money, and a few records that went with it. Then a bit later on, I came across the Edison Home Phonograph, bigger and better, with the great big horn. Now, these big horns are very rare, of course, very rare indeed, because once the technology changed, of course, people weren't prepared to give them house room. So most of the horns, most of the photographs ended up in the tip once things moved on. So these photographs came to my possession in the early 1960s. Patricia and I got married in 1969. She would never have let me buy them after that.
And what was it that did replace them?
Now, what replaced it was the gramophone, and the technology, broadly speaking, is this. The phonograph went round a cylinder, and there's a limitation to the movement of the needle and the diaphragm, and hence a much restricted range of sound that was available. Now, the gramophone, a flat disc, it went round in a different way, of course, but the hill and vale motion of the needle on the flat gramophone record gave a better quality of sound. It's still completely mechanical, you still had to wind it up, and you still had the horn, but you got a better quality of sound. Now that came in roughly the first decade of the 20th century, and so it was a better quality. The cylinders were clumsy to store, took up a lot of space. The gramophone record just went into a flat paper sleeve, and you could store lots of them in a cabinet much more conveniently. So it was better quality, easy to cope with, still quite expensive. Now, here are two advertisements. This one shows an early demonstration of the phonograph, and people are listening through rubber tubes. It's set up in an exhibition somewhere, and people are still totally fascinated by the recorded human voice. And plainly the next thing is to get them to buy one. So here's an advertisement, again for a phonograph, not a gramophone. And I got this from the Phonograph Society of Australia, which used to exist. This is about 20, 25 years ago. No, it'd be older than that, wouldn't it? It would be about 60 years ago. Probably doesn't exist still, but there were people who collected them, and they had a meet once every so often in the Methodist Church Hall in Gordon, and obviously people traded bits and pieces and traded cylinders, and they listened to each other's equipment. So I'll read it in part. It says, "What will you do in the long, cold, dark, shivery evenings? Indoors." This is well before radio. Why? Have a phonograph, of course. It is the finest entertainment in the world. There is nothing equal to it in the whole realm of art. It imitates any and every musical instrument, any and every natural sound, faithfully. The human voice, the voice of the cataract, the boom of the gun, the voices of birds or animals. And the cost from 2 guineas, now that's £2 and 2 shillings, and that is a social statement, because you charged in guineas for something that was special. You know, a doctor would render his account in guineas. A good, prestigious public school for nice people would charge in guineas. So 2 guineas for a photograph meant that the working class could never afford them, because that was roughly what the income of workmen was at that time, beginning of the 20th century. So the middle classes would have had to save up their money, the 2 guineas for the instrument, and probably 5 shillings for the cylinders. So it was an aspirational thing for a middle class family to have a phonograph.
And so in that sense, would it have been a sign of status to invite people over and listen to it on a Sunday afternoon, or?
Oh yes, definitely. Exactly the same thing happened with television in the late 50s. Because television hit Australia in 1956. People used to camp on winter evenings outside shop windows, and the shops would have their black and white televisions with the volume turned up loud inside the shop window, so people could watch what was on, such as Test cricket or rugby union or rugby league. And then, of course, once they'd saved up enough, they could go and buy their own black and white television with a screen about 6 inches by 4 inches.
Now you've managed to keep these for a long time then, like that's the best part of 60 years as well.
That's right.
Are they? What's the secret of keeping them safe and secure?
They have a wooden cover, and outwardly they look for all the world like a Singer sewing machine. So you store them in a cupboard or somewhere. Next door to your Singer sewing machine, probably.
And how many cylinders do you actually have? Do you have any special cylinders in particular?
Nothing particularly special. There's 2 or 3 boxes of cylinders that are required, like the British Empire, in a fit of absent-mindedness. The best cylinders came not just in a cardboard cylinder, but the cardboard cylinder was lined with lamb's wool, so that that wouldn't scratch the cylinder. And hopefully that would mean you wouldn't get such a scratchy sound.
Fantastic. And what have you particularly enjoyed about having them? When did you use them in class at school?
Yes, they were used mainly for media studies. So you talk about the origins of mass media, printing obviously, from hundreds of years ago, Gutenberg onwards. And then of course mass literacy especially led to an explosion of printing in the mid to late 19th century. And as far as recorded sound, of course, this was absolutely the first. It was totally without precedent. And then, of course, the age of the acoustic gramophone and the age of the phonograph disappeared completely in the mid-1920s with electrical recording using a microphone and with electrical amplification using a loudspeaker, all contained, of course, within a cabinet. So these things came to a very quick end in the mid-1920s.
Which was the wireless. So that's what
superseded
both of them.
The wireless superseded both of them, yes. But the first wirelesses, you didn't have a loudspeaker. You listened in. You had earphones on your ears to exclude other sound. So my Uncle Bob was a boy in the 1920s, and he liked to tinker with things. He later went into the Air Force, made his career in the Air Force, but he liked to tinker with the wireless. And he had a cat's whisker, as they had in those days, and I have no idea what it was called, but you filled with your apparatus, with a cat's whisker, whatever that was, and you listened in. Didn't listen to the wireless, you listened in to the wireless. On one occasion he persuaded his grandmother, Grandma Bromley. She was widowed, and so she lived with them. On one occasion, once only, Uncle Bob persuaded his grandmother to listen in to the wireless, once only. She would never listen to it again. As far as she was concerned, it was the invention of the devil. If she'd listened to Triple J, she would have known that she was quite right.
Or modern social media.
Indeed, even more so.
Yes. Well, thanks for sharing all that. Is there anything else that we haven't covered?
Take a look at your list of questions.
No, I think we're doing okay.
Right.
Okay. Well, thanks, Dad. That's been very informative and fascinating. So thanks for showing off the Edisons. Thank you.
Well, it's been my great pleasure. I should mention that I made use of it in class probably 2 or 3 times a year. It meant lugging all the equipment to school, of course, but the kids would come in and totally fascinated by this very strange apparatus, wondered why people ever bothered to listen in the first instance.
Exactly
Things
right.
have changed so rapidly in less than a century, and so fundamentally.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, David.
Thank you.